Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Dread Time Stories. I'm your host, Dr. Phobia, and tonight our story comes from the world of creepypastas. More specifically, Disney creepypastas. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Abandoned by Disney. Some of you have heard that the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real live ghost town. They built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. But it didn't start out as a ghost town. Disney cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is fact. Look it up. Disney blew $30 million on the place. Yes, $30 million. Then, they abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters, too shallow for their ships to safely operate, and there was even a blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, they were too lazy to work on a regular schedule. This is where the factual nature of their story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and it obviously wasn't because foreigners are lazy. Both are convenient excuses. No, I sincerely doubt that those reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy the official story? It's because of Mowgli's Palace. Disney began construction of Mowgli's Palace in the late 90s. The concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Mowgli, then you better remember the story, The Jungle Book. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you'd know it as the Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened/pursued by other animals. Mowgli's Palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney bought up a ton of high-priced land for the project, and there was actually a scandal involving some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, then turned around and sold the properties to Disney. At one point, a home that had just been constructed was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly for some fictional highway project. Knowing full well what was going on, people started calling it Mickey Mouse Highway. There was even concept art. A group of stuffed shirts from Disney Company came and held an actual city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this project was going to be. And when they showed the concept art, this gigantic Indian palace, surrounded by jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear, well, suffice to say that everyone flipped. We're talking about a large Indian palace, jungle, and loincloths, not only in the center of a relatively wealthy area, but also in a somewhat xenophobic area of the South. It was a questionable mix at that point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was immediately subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. So anyway, Treasure Island, the Bahamas. Disney sunk millions in there and then split. The same thing happened with Mowgli's Palace. Construction was complete. Visitors were actually staying at the resort. The surrounding communities were flooded with traffic and the usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irate tourists. Then, it all just stopped. Disney shut it down and no one knew what the heck to think. But they were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this in the first place. I honestly didn't give the place another thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I live maybe 4 hours from Emerald Island, so I only really heard rumblings and didn't experience any of it firsthand. Then I read this article from someone who had explored the Treasure Island Resort and posted a whole blog about all the crazy stuff he found there. Stuff just left behind. Things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by disgruntled former employees who had lost their job. Heck, even the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking the place. People just felt angry about Treasure Island, as the folks did here about Mowgli's palace. Plus, there were rumors that Disney had released their aquarium stock into the local waters when it closed, including sharks. Who wouldn't want to take a few swings at some merchandise after that? Well, what I'm getting at this blog about Treasure Island has really got me thinking. Even though it has been many years since its closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration at Mowgli's palace. Take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there was anything I could take home as a memento. I'm not going to say I wasted no time getting there, because honestly it took me another year after I first found that Treasure Island article to get around to going up to Emerald Isle. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research of the Palace Resort, or rather, tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made mention of the place. That had been scrubbed clean. Even odder, however, is that no one before myself apparently thought to blog about the place or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though it was expected that since they had all swung Disney's way, they wouldn't be able to laud out their embarrassment, you know? Recently, I learned that corporations can ask Google, for example, to remove links from such search results, basically for no good reason. Looking back, this is probably why no one ever spoke of the resort, because their words were made inaccessible. So in the end, I could barely find the place. I had to go using this old as hell map I had received back in the mail in the 90s. It was a promotional item sent out to people who had been to Disney World recently. And I guess since I had been there in the late 80s, that was recent. I didn't really intend to hang on to it. It just got shoved in with my books and comics from my childhood. I had only remembered it months into my research. And even then, it took me a few weeks to locate the storage bin in which my parents had shoved it all into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most were transplants who had moved to the beach in recent years, or old residents who just sneered at me and made rude gestures the second I managed to say, "Where do I find Mowgli's?" The drive took me through a long corridor of overgrowth. Tropical plants had run rampant and overpopulated the area, mixed in with native species of flora that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort, tremendous wooden gates whose supports on either side looked like they had been cut from the giant sequoias. The gate itself had been gouged in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging on the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap, with hand-painted letters scrawled in black. Abandoned by Disney. Clearly the handiwork of some past local or an employee who wanted to make some small protest. The gates were open enough to walk through, but not drive. So grabbing my digital camera and the map, whose flip side showed the layout of the resort, I set off on foot. The inner grounds of the place were just as overgrown as the entryway. Palm trees stood unattended and ragged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants similarly stood by their own stinking, bug-ridden refuse. There were a sort of clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxiously tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. All that remained of any outdoor structures were broken, rotting wood and various charred bits of undefinable material. It was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar, was now simply in a pile of assorted debris chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing on the grounds was a statue of Baloo, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, which stood in a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial wave toward no one, staring into an empty space with a silly, toothy grin as bird crap covered the whole swaths of his fur and vines ensnared his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti where the original paint had peeled and chipped away. The front doors weren't just open, they were taken off their hinges and stolen. Above the front doors, or the gaping maw where they had been, someone once again painted "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you about all the awesome stuff I saw inside the palace. Forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums, but no. The inside of the building was so stark, so bare, that I actually think people stole the molding off the walls. Anything that was too big to steal, counters, desk, giant fake trees, were all resting among this empty echo chamber that amplified my every step like a slow rat-a-tat-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed to all locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen was as you imagined, an industrial food prep area with appliances and space, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place seemed to smell of very old piss. The huge freezer was not even remotely cold now, had a row upon row of empty shelf space. Hooks that hung from the ceiling, probably for hanging cuts of meat. As I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. Each hook was swinging in a random direction, but their movements were so slow and small, it was almost impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by my footsteps, so I stopped one from swinging by clutching it with my fist, then carefully letting it go. But within a few seconds, it started swinging once more. The bathrooms were in such the same state as the rest of the resort. Just like the Treasure Island Resort, someone had methodically smashed each porcelain commode with coconuts and other implements. There was about a half-inch of rancid, stinking, stagnant water on the floor, so I didn't stay there very long. But what's odd about the toilets and the sinks, and the bidets in the ladies' room, yes, I was in there, all dripped and leaked, or just ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have shut the water off a long time ago. There were plenty of rooms in the resort, but naturally I didn't have time to go through them all. The few I did peer into were similarly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find much there. I thought there was actually a television or a radio in one room, as I really think I heard a quiet conversation coming out. Though it was like a whisper, probably my own breathing echoing in the silence, or just another case of sound flowing of water playing tricks on me. This is what it sounded like. I didn't believe it. A short, unknown reply. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Well, your father told you. Then an unknown reply, or possibly just weeping. I know, that sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced. Why I thought there might have been something running around that room, or worse, some vagrants who had holed up there and probably would have knifed me. At the front door of the palace again, I figured I hadn't found anything of note and had wasted the trip up. But as I looked out the door, I noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I had apparently missed. Something that would at least give me one thing to show for my trouble, even if it was just a photograph. There was a lifelike statue of a python, maybe up to 80 feet long, coiled up and sunning itself on a pedestal right in the center of the area. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell on the object in the perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo, then stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved closer again to get a detail of its face. Slowly and casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly into my eyes, turned and slithered off the pedestal across the grass into the trees. All 80 feet of it. Its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunning spot. Disney had released all their exotic animals onto the ground. Right there on the floor plan map was the reptile house. I should have known. I'd read about the sharks at Treasure Island, so I should have known they'd done this. I was just dumbfounded, just utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back down to earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, back towards the palace. Even though it was totally gone, I still wasn't taking any chances and backed my way into the building. It took a few deep breaths and slaps to my own face to get me right in the head after that. I looked for a place to sit down as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at this point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in the broken glass and dead leaf carpet or haul myself up onto the desk of questionable reliability. I had seen some stairs near the palace lobby and decided to go have a seat there until I felt better. The staircase was far enough away from the front of the building to be relatively clean, save for a startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall and once again painted with the "Abandoned by Disney" motto I had become accustomed to. I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat there for a moment to keep at least something clean. The stairway led down, below ground level. Using my camera as a flashlight, I could see the staircase led to a metal mesh door with a padlock. A sign on the door, a real sign, read, "Mascots only. Thank you." This perked up my spirits a little bit for two reasons. One, a mascot-only area would definitely have some interesting stuff back in the day. Two, the padlock was still in place. No one had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the one place I could actually explore and perhaps find something interesting to photograph or steal. I had come to the palace essentially agreeing with myself that it was okay to take anything because, hey, it was abandoned. It didn't take much to bust the lock. Well, actually that's wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was hooked to. Time and decay had done most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws out of the wall. Something no one else apparently thought of, or had been able to do at the time. The mascots only area was a startling and very welcomed change from the rest of the building I'd seen. For one, every second or third fluorescent overhead light was illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken, even if age and exposure had definitely taken their toll. Tables had pads and pens. There were clocks, even a punch clock on the wall, complete with a filled-out time cards. Chairs were scattered around, and there was even a small break room with an old static-filled television and rotted-out food and drink on the counters. It was like one of those post-apocalyptic movies where everything was left in a state of evacuation. As I walked the maze-like sub-basement hallways of the mascot-only area, the sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and chairs were knocked over, papers scattered, and most melted with the damp floor. A large carpet of mold was slowly overtaking the real rotting crimson floor covering. Everything was just sort of squishy. Anything wood disintegrated into mush when I applied the least amount of force. Clothing items hanging on hooks in one of the rooms simply fell into moist threads if I tried to unhook them. One thing that annoyed me was the light was becoming less sparse and reliable the further I went into the dank, suffocating depths of this place. Eventually, I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words Character Prep 1 stenciled on it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured it was probably where the costumes were kept, and I definitely wanted a photograph of that twisted, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That is, until I gave up and started walking away. Then there was a slight popping sound, and the door slowly creaked open. Inside, the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used my camera flash to look for a light switch on the wall by the door, but there was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred out of my sense of excitement by a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed to life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest I had passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed like the light was going to keep getting brighter until all the bulbs exploded. But just as I thought it would reach that critical state, the lights dimmed and then steadied. The room was exactly as I pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together like strange cartoon cadavers hung from invisible nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and native clothes on their hangers towards the back. What I found odd, and what I wanted to photograph right away, was a Mickey costume in the center of the room. Unlike the rest of the costumes, it was lying on its back in the center of the floor, like a murder victim. The fur on the costume was rotten and shredding, creating bare patches. What was even odder, however, was the coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey Mouse. Black where he should be white, and white where he should be black. His normal red overalls were light blue. The sight was put off enough to actually... The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put photographing it until the very last. I took a picture of the costumes hanging on the walls, upward angles, downward angles, side shots, to show an entire row, putrid cartoon faces, some with plastic eyes missing. Then I decided to stage a shot, just one of the bejangled characters' heads from the grimy, sticky floor. I reached for the headpiece of a Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so it wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked into the face of the wide-eyed, moldering head, a loud clatter sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and there between my shoes was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. The empty face and the lower jaw remained, staring up at me. I dropped the duck head immediately, and as you'd expect, moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back to the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, I had to. For a number of reasons it may seem silly, but only if you don't think it through. I'd need proof of what happened, especially if Disney was going to somehow make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind right from the start that even if this was gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when the Mickey, that photo negative opposite Mickey in the middle of the room, started to get up. First sitting up, then climbing to its feet, the Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside of it, stood there in the center of the room. Its fake face staring directly at me as I mumbled, "No," over and over and over. With shaking hands, a violently thrashing heart, and legs that had once again turned to jelly, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposing creature, now quietly sizing me up. The digital cameras displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen wherever the Mickey outline moved to. Then the camera died, went blank, quiet, and broken. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. "Hey," it said in a hushed, perverted, but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice. "Want to see my head come off?" It started to pull at its own head, working clumsily with glove-clad fingers around its neck with clawing, impatient movements similar to a wounded man trying to free himself from a predator's jaws. As it worked its digits into its neck, so much blood. So much thick, chunky, yellow blood. As I turned away, I heard the sickening tearing of cloth and flesh, and I only cared about getting away. Above the doorway out of this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal with bone or fingernails. Abandoned by God. I never got the pictures out of the camera. I never wrote the blog entry about it. After I ran from that place, I fled for my sanity, if not my very life. I knew why Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in, and they didn't want anything like that getting out. That was Abandoned by Disney. Definitely the longest creepypasta we've read on this channel, so I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for listening. Like I always say in closing, check under your bed, look in your closet, and sleep with the light on. The life you save may very well be your own. Good night, everyone.